right, thank you for sharing the results, Corey. So welcome to POPCORE 3. This is harvest and use of eco-orchard plants. So this evening we'll do an overview of some of POP's favorite perennial food crops, and we'll also be discussing different harvest and processing methods. Next slide. So presenting this evening, we have Phil Forsyth, who is our co-executive director for POP. We have Corey Spellman Lopez, who is our education director, and myself, Sharon Apia. I am the orchard manager with the Philadelphia Orchard Project. We also want to know who you are and who's all here with us this evening. So please share in the chat your name, where you are viewing from, and just share. We'd love to see why you're here. What are some of your favorite fruit and harvesting and processing methods? We will have time for question and answering in between the sections, but we do ask that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can get to them. So this is our POPCORE workshop series. For those who are here for the first time or might be unfamiliar, this is presented through the Philadelphia Orchard Project. We are a nonprofit that plants and supports community orchards all over the city. We have 66 sites, and every year we do POPCORE, which stands for the Philadelphia Orchard Project Community Orchard Resilience Education. So it's a 4-part workshop series that we do every March, every Tuesday evening. So we kicked off on March 1st with ecological orchard care and pruning. Last week, we talked about pest and disease management. This week, we're here this evening to talk about orchard harvest, use and processing methods. And next week will be our last installment where we will be discussing orchard design and establishing your own orchard. So if you haven't already, you can sign up on phillyorchards.org, I believe on the events page. And that's also a great place to check out if you are interested in getting involved with us. I believe Corey's going to talk more about different ways that folks can get involved, but that's a great place to start. All right. Just to quickly do an overview of this evening's agenda, Corey will be presenting on diverse yields of eco-orchards. So she'll be talking about gleaning and foraging, which will cover some stuff about POP Harvest and our POP Harvest education program. We'll also just talk about safety and ethics of gleaning. And then we'll be talking about harvest timing and equipment for fruits in our area, processing and preservation equipment and techniques. We'll talk about easy to grow alternatives to most known and common fruits. And then we'll also just be going over different orchard proteins, herbal allies, and volunteer plants that you can have in your orchard space. And then at the end, we'll have some time for some question and answering. But just to reiterate, if you have any questions along the way, please share it in the chat. We'll be taking a few brief moments in between sections to do some question and answering. All right. And with that being said, I believe I'm going to pass it off to Corey, who's going to get us started this evening.
Yes, thank you, Sharon, and thank you for everyone for joining us again on a Tuesday evening, and this time with the sun out and at warm, nice weather. We appreciate you being here with us. Okay, so why are we talking about this tonight? Well, a big reason is that we don't just plant orchards that are straight fruit trees, a straight apple tree orchard, which is what most children will draw if you ask them what do you think of an orchard, but we plant mixed fruit orchards, food forests even, that diversify the yields, incorporating native plants like Paw Paws and easier to grow non-native fruits like figs, perennial vines, berry bushes, brambles, herbs, root crops, all mixed in to make this food forest planting. And we're going to talk more about that next week when we talk about the design, more about the layers and the different plants that are held within them. But let's talk about pop harvest education. A big goal of ours is to introduce Philadelphians to the underutilized abundance that surrounds us in our street trees and the growing spaces around us. And a lot of the plants that grow the best in our orchards are uncommon, and when and how to harvest them and consume them can be confusing. So we've been trying to build up our resources for you in this area, and you can find them on our blog or by joining our email list, attending workshops, and so on. We're going to talk more and more about that tonight. But this workshop is going to focus on harvest information, equipment, and processing, and those easier to grow, more uncommon fruits and how to use them. So the Pop Harvest program is a program where we try to coordinate folks coming together to harvest abundant, often underutilized edible fruits and nuts growing around our city in the form of street trees like Juneberries, mulberries, ginkgos, hawthorns, acorns, crab apples. And along with this, we've developed maps of the edible street trees from public data, and we encourage you to add to that with street trees that you know of, so that we can all share in the abundance. And we have expanded that program with a Pop Harvest Ed program, which is made up of educational workshops done by POP staff, but we hope to increasingly make it by community educators, teaching on things. In the past, we've taught about making fire cider with Trifoliate Oranges. Different herbalists have come in and taught that for us. We've done acorn flour processing, making a lot of different herbal preparations, ginkgo nut processing, elderberry syrup, just a lot of interesting things to learn to make with the things that are growing around us. And if you are someone who likes to teach about these things or know somebody who likes to teach about these lesser known edibles, please contact me. My email is Corey@phillyorchards.org, and I would love to talk to you about how we could collaborate. So like I said, talk to me. We have lots of different things that we'd love for more people to use. And if it's not a workshop, we also love it when people do a guest blog or video or different ways to get involved. So if you have an enthusiasm to share what you know, talk to me. And then, as I mentioned before, we have developed a lot of resources to try to help you on your journey and using the harvest and knowing what it is and how to use it. So keep up on that by joining our mailing list for harvest events where we go out and glean, to learn about workshops, or to learn when we put out different plant highlights, spotlighting Nanking cherries or Goumis or these lesser known fruits. Also on our website, on the resource page, there's a lot of recipes and DIY, so you can find them there. And on Instagram and Facebook, we like to share out seasonal updates of what's going on, what's ready, how to use them, come join us, that sort of thing. So follow us there if you aren't already. And then also just encourage you to check out some other groups. There's many groups around the city too. We would recommend are the Aubrey Wild Wisdom group that I believe is run by a former POP employee, and the Wild Foodies Meetup. And if you know of another good one, please share with everyone in the chat. And now I'm going to pass it to Phil.
Thanks, Corey. So I'm going to talk a little bit about gleaning and foraging, particularly talking about safety and ethics. Obviously, the core program of POP is planting new orchards and communities. We also, as Corey's talked about, help to educate the public, city residents about abundance that's all around us. Just a quick definition of terms, if you're not clear on the difference, gleaning is traditionally picking excess harvest or leftover harvest from a farm or orchard that would otherwise go to waste. And sometimes farms or other growing spaces will also set aside a row to be gleaned. This is common to many cultures around the world for those in need. Foraging is harvesting of wild foods or abundance often from community spaces, and has been key to human survival and food since time immemorial. So I also wanted to mention, pop orchards are generally not planted with the intention to be gleaned or foraged by the general public. They're planted with community partners. So please be aware of that. If you go to our map of orchard sites, those are not sites for you to go and pick from for the most part. Next slide. So obviously there are some dangers involved with gleaning and foraging. So just a quick summary of this one is that we stress that no one should consume any parts of wild edible plants, herbs, weed, trees, or other bushes unless you have verified with your health professional that they're safe for you. You also, if you're trying a new food, as Matt mentioned in the chat, please consume in small quantities to make sure your body can process them, that you're not allergic. And information in this presentation and our other Pop Harvest series is for educational purposes only, and you should never interpret this as a substitute for professional treatment or diagnosis by a medical professional. And next slide. So ethics come into play when you're cultivating a relationship with the environment. And without a sense of ethics with this, we are lost and we are robbing our neighbors and future generations of harvests. So please keep some of these things in mind. Tread lightly, be a good steward, take what you need and use all that you take. And if there is an abundance, be sure to share it. Don't damage plants as you harvest. Don't harvest from communities that are not your own. You should never assume that someone is not going to be making use of plants in their own neighborhood. If you are harvesting outside of your neighborhood, be sure to get permission and ask. Know where you are and your impact. Be aware of things like which plants are endangered, which ones are considered invasive, and therefore should be harvested as much as possible. There's many sources of information on that, including United Plant Savers. Be aware how plants reproduce so that you're not interfering with their life cycle and again, reducing them for people in the future to harvest from. Things like ramps have been over harvested in the wild. So we need to keep this in mind to make sure that everyone has access to these in the future. Think about wildlife needs. Some of these plants are essential for birds and other wildlife. So think about that as you're harvesting too. And always respect the environment and the work of stewards, both current stewards of the land, but also past and future stewards. Next slide. Be 100% certain of identification. There are, especially in terms of mushrooms, there are potentially poisonous lookalikes. But certainly, not every berry is safe to eat. You need to be sure of what you're picking. And potential allergies, drug interactions, these are all things to be aware of. And obviously know your harvest times and when fruit is ripe. We'll talk more about how you can tell that kind of thing. And then think about potential contamination, runoff from roads and other possible sources of pollution, roadways, herbicides, pesticides. Be aware that many urban soils have lead and other heavy metals. So be very careful around picking leafy greens, roots, or fruit and nuts that have fallen to the ground. You need to be extra cautious about and pay special attention to cleaning them before consumption. Always ask permission before harvesting. Listen to people and plants, the environment, and your gut in making these decisions about harvesting. Practice safe food handling as you would with anything. Glean, forage, and harvest at your own risk. This is a choice you're making, and you need to take responsibility for it. And last, we want to suggest that everyone practice gratitude when they harvest. Give thanks to the earth, plants, and ecosystems that provide for us, and also to the stewards that have cared for them. Again, both past and present. And we're going to move on to harvest timing and equipment. So how to tell when fruits are ripe and how to pick them. So some simple guidelines for telling when fruit is ripe. One is that you can refer to our monthly task list, which for each month of the year has basic tasks for orchard care, but also includes which fruits ripen in that month. We also have a harvest calendar that is just the months of the year and what fruits you can expect to ripen then. But then when actually examining the plant, harvest times can vary by a couple of weeks from year to year based on weather and other conditions. So you'll want to examine them for their base color, which you can see in the photo of the apples here. The base color is what's beneath that red blush, so that it'll usually, in the case of an apple, transition from green to yellow, even if it's a red apple. A little harder to tell on an apple that stays green, but that is one way to tell. Texture, obviously, some fruits, like many berries or stone fruits, will get somewhat soft when they're ready to pick. Smell, a ripe fruit often starts to have its fragrance when it's fully ripe. And if you're not sure, you can always taste something before you pick, all the fruit from your tree. Try one out. Make sure that it's actually at a ripe stage. Ripe fruit will also separate easily from the stem, both for tree fruits as well as berries. You shouldn't have to be yanking on them. If they are ripe, they will come off generally quite easily. Tannin levels are another sign of ripeness, and this is something you need to be aware of with certain fruits. Tannins are what cause astringency, so things like persimmons and berries like chokeberries are really inedible until they're fully ripe because of the high tannin levels, which are nature's way of telling animals that something is not ripe. The fruit wants you to wait until its seeds are fully developed so it can reproduce itself. Is that for the plant? Of course, that's the whole purpose of the fruit. So that is not, only certain fruits have high tannin levels. And then Brix is a way to measure sugar. This is how a commercial orchard would tell the optimal picking time for their fruit with specialized devices that measure the sugar level in the fruit. Next slide. So one we want to highlight that's often tricky is knowing when to pick pears, and that is because European pears, for the most part, don't ripen on the tree or should not be left to ripen on the tree. They will ripen unevenly, and the quality of the fruit will be poor if you leave them on the tree until they're ripe. So there's two basic kinds of European pears. They're your summer pears and your winter pears. Summer pears are usually picked in August, September, and they will, after picked, ripen after a few days of room temperature storage. These include Bartlett and many other Bartlett-like varieties like Harrow Delight, Shenandoah, Colette, many others. And most of these have that classic pear shape that you can see on the bottom row of the photo. And then there are winter pears, which are generally picked a little bit later, September, October. And once picked, they need 2 to 3 weeks of cold storage before they ripen. And these include Anjou, Bosque, Goumis, Moonglow, Potomac, Kiefer, many others. So when you choose your tree that you're planting in your yard, this is a good thing to look up and understand about your tree in terms of picking time and how to get them ready to ripen off the tree. And then there is a couple varieties. Seckel is one of our favorites, and Lincoln is another, and they actually ripen on the tree. So those are a couple exceptions to the rule. And then Asian pears also ripen on the tree, which makes them a little easier. So here's our harvest calendar. I saw Kim shared the document in the chat, but this is listing by month. So if you have a nice diverse orchard, you can start picking fruit in May and all the way through November, even December, with some of those really late season fruits. So, you know, it's a pretty long season of harvest with your perennial crops. And each fruit has its own storage time, from our, you know, best classic storage fruit, the apple, which can last 3 to 5 months in proper storage, to ones that really last a matter of days. So your cherries and many of your berries really only will last a few days. You know, Paw Paws is another one that tends to last a very short time. This 2 to 3 weeks, but my experience, it's maybe a week at most for Paw Paws. And there's ideal storage temperatures as well. So now we're getting to how you harvest. You know, once you've figured out whether they're ripe or not, one, you know, key thing to keep in mind is using gentle hands when you're harvesting. Again, we said most fruits will come off easily when they're fully ripe, but just be aware that you can damage fruit and reduce its storage time by you know rough harvesting. So do it gently. Be careful of the plant as well as the fruit. And this is a good time to also, you know, examine the fruit as you're picking it. Ones that have some damage to them, or maybe slightly overripe, maybe those are the ones you sample along the way and take the best ones to, you know, bring home or do whatever you're going to do with them. And then we have our pole harvester. As your trees get taller, very simple and easy device for harvesting fruit high in the tree. Again, if fruit is fully ripe, it'll come off easily. So you don't want to be yanking around in your tree and potentially damaging some of the limbs by uncareful harvest. But there should be still a couple of these available in the West Philly Tool Library for people to borrow, that we gave to them about 5 years ago. And then I'm curious about both PHS and Parks and Rec have brand new tool libraries, and I wonder if they have these. But anyway, they're generally maybe $30 for the cheapest models that work fine. Tripod orchard ladder, something that we mentioned in the pruning workshop, but also very helpful for harvesting your trees. You know, a 10-foot ladder gets you way up in the tree, so you can reach a lot of it by hand. And then we have the shake and tarp method. So this is a way to harvest fruits very high in the tree, especially small fruits. So we've used this most often for mulberry trees, which can get 30, 35 feet tall. But when they're ripe, they shake easily off the tree. So you have some people holding a tarp underneath and someone shaking the branches, and you can get a lot of fruit fast with this method. It can also be used for nut trees as well. And then we have the Nut Wizard, which is a fun little device, basically a sort of wire ball on a pole. And this is intended for harvesting off the ground. Most nuts fall to the ground when they're ripe. And this is a very easy way to harvest. You just kind of roll it over the surface of the ground and it gathers the nuts. So there's different sizes of wire for different sized fruits. You can see also here it's being used for some fallen apples as well, at the largest size. And next, I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of all the wonderful things you can do with the harvest. Our intention here is not to, teach you the minutia of each of these techniques, but just give you some inspiration. And as Corey mentioned, we have Pop Harvest Ed workshops throughout the year on different of these techniques where you can learn more and practice them together. So one that came up in the poll that most folks had not done was drying fruit. And this is a very simple technique that you really don't need specialized equipment for. It's a wonderful way to preserve the harvest. Of course, we're all very familiar with some of the common dried fruits like raisins, apple rings, etc. But this is a pretty wonderful technique. You can use a commercial dehydrator. I'll show you images of that later. Or you can use an oven or a DIY solar powered dehydrator. But basically what you're looking to do is by drying, remove most of the moisture from the fruit and therefore allow it to be resistant to spoilage. And because you're not heating it, you're retaining pretty much all of the nutrient value of the fruit. So in that way, it can be superior to canning and other techniques in terms of preservation of nutrients. So you want to always do this at a low temperature. Don't be tempted to try to do it faster at a high temp, because that may result in sealing the outside of the fruit, making it so that all the moisture can't escape. You generally want to sort, wash, and slice foods evenly to the same thickness so they dry at the same amount of time. Some fruits may need to be blanched, putting sort of quickly through a steam bath or boiling water. Others can be dipped in lemon juice to retain flavor and color. And yeah, always allow dried fruit to cool before storing, stored in an airtight container. So let's go to the next slide here. I think we have some approximate times for drying different fruits, and whether or not it's recommended to blanch them or dip them before drying. Next slide. So of examples of dehydrators, I've got one of these little commercial plug-in electric dehydrators like you see in the upper left. Really easy to use. Just slice the fruit or put herbs in there. You can make jerky or other things too. They're quite versatile. But they just plug in and don't use a lot of electricity and slowly dry things out over a period of hours. You can also make one of these DIY solar dehydrators using the sun's energy to dry fruit and other things. Those are pretty cool. You can also use your oven. In that case, you would set it on pretty much the lowest setting, 140 to 170 degrees. And you want to crack the door of your oven open because there needs to be a place for the moisture to escape. It works faster, better if you have a little fan blowing into the oven as well, or a convection oven works great for that reason. And then last, I just want to mention fruit leathers. Similar technique, but basically you puree a fruit first and spread it thin and then dehydrate. So another great technique that can be used for any fruits. Refrigeration, freezer, obviously another thing most people already have in their house, but a great way to extend the shelf life of many fruits. Freezer is great, especially if you're really busy during the growing season, don't have time to process things, bag it up, throw it in there, and then later on, make smoothies out of it or jams and jellies when you're a little less busy later in the season, or use it for baking. So, very common technique. Jams, jellies, preserves, and other things. Just to quickly go over the differences, jam is generally made of whole fruit cut into pieces or crushed, heated with water and sugar to activate pectin before putting into containers. Some fruits have natural pectin, others needs to be added. Some also require additional acidification. So beware of the recommendations for the particular fruit you're working with. Jellies are the same idea, except instead of whole fruit, they're made from the juice of a fruit and have a clearer, more smooth texture. Marmalades are citrus spreads using both the peel and pulp of the fruit. Preserves are spreads that have chunks of fruit surrounded by jelly. fruit butter. We've made crab apple butter and other apple butters many times. And that is slow cooked fruit and sugar that is kind of thicker. Very nice product. All right, next slide. Food mill, wonderful device to have for processing fruit. So it's basically a combination of a strainer and masher or saucer. So basically you're crushing the fruit and pushing it through a strainer. And it's a wonderful way to make applesauce, or also it's really useful for separating really seedy fruits. I've used this for Goumis and Paw Paws to separate the flesh or pulp of the fruit from the seeds and the skin. So a very useful thing to have around. Then you have fruit-based sauces and syrups. Again, similar to jams and jellies, so you can make barbecue sauces, hot sauces, syrups, toppings for ice cream and other things. Pretty easy to make as well. And then you can't think about fruit without thinking of pies and other baked goods. There are endless possibilities, from blueberry pancakes and muffins to breads, cakes, fruit bars, etc. It's a good way to use frozen fruits, and many are interchangeable. You can switch out one for another in various recipes, mix different fruits together. A lot of fun, and every year we look forward to seeing with some of our pop harvest events, seeing what our various partners make with the fruit that we harvest. We had some mulberry hand pies with Little Pop Shop last year. So another way to process fruit, our cider press is always a big hit at our fall festivals. Seeing fresh apples turn into the sweetest, most delicious juice with our cider press, a great press as well. And of course, this is the first step in making ciders and other beverages. So of course, you can make various beverages out of fruit. Cider is not limited to apples. Cider making has really exploded in recent years, like beer making did a decade ago. And you see all kinds of different ciders out there incorporating different fruits, not just apples. Wine is not limited to grapes. You can make cherry wines and peach wines, various berries, persimmons, even non-fruit wines like dandelion wine are a possibility. And you can attend local classes and get supplies through places like Philly Homebrew. So there's very much a culture of making these in Philadelphia that you can connect with. And last, I wanted to mention pickles and ferments. Typically, pickles are more made with vegetables. We do plant perennial vegetables in our orchards that are good for this, but you can pickle fruits as well and get some interesting flavors. But it's generally not a long-term preservation method because of the high sugar content in fruit. They tend to last a matter of weeks rather than months. But one thing we have been experimenting with in recent years is pickling our green fruits. So in May, June, we go through and thin the fruit from our orchards, and a classic use of stone fruits in particular is making pickles out of these unripe green fruits at that time. We've had several volunteers experiment with that in recent years with green plums and green peaches that are thinned out in thinning season. And just to mention, a fermentation crock is a useful device in fermenting things that essentially helps to separate what's being fermented from the air, and therefore excluding potential negative microorganisms. You can certainly also ferment in mason jars and other things like that. So we thought we'd take a break at this point and see if there were any questions or things that people want to share. We find that these harvest themed workshops, people often have favorite recipes or uses of fruits that they like to share. So we just wanted to open it up for a few minutes if anyone wants to share or has a question for us. I see Kim shared in the chat our recipe for unripe plums, how to make pickles out of those. If no one has a question, we can move on.
It looks like someone put a question in the chat. Paul asked, how does ripening vary across a tree typically, top to bottom?
That's a good question. In my experience, the trees tend to ripen fairly evenly. The more sun a fruit gets, the quicker it'll ripen. So sometimes you might get fruit at the top of the tree or the ends of branches ripening slightly sooner. But in my experience, fruits that don't ripen all at once, like persimmons, usually ripen over several weeks. It seems to be, I haven't noticed a pattern to which ones are ripening. They seem to drop kind of evenly over the tree. I don't know if anyone has any other experiences with different ripening on parts of the tree they would want to share. I saw there was also a question about walnuts that I don't think I know anything about. Does anyone know about pickling walnuts? Or have pickled other nuts? Not something I've tried to do. All right, well, why don't we move on? We'll have another time for sharing and questions at the end. But I'll turn it over to Sharon for kick off our plant analogs section.
Awesome, thank you, Phil. So we're going to talk about easy to grow alternatives to common fruits. Apples and peaches, or apples and stone fruit, are two of the most challenging fruits to grow in our humid climate. And then fruits like banana trees are pretty challenging to grow if you don't have a greenhouse. So what can you grow instead? Let's talk about it. So we have the Asian pear. This is a great alternative if you are interested in growing apples. Because apples may require more intensive spraying and pest management. An Asian pear is just as crunchy and just as juicy as an apple, but the only difference being it has more of that mild pear flavor. Another upside of the Asian pear is that it ripens on the tree around August and September. So unlike the European pears, it ripens on the tree. So once it's ready, you can just pick it. You don't have to consider ripening times. The Asian pear is high in fiber and vitamin K, and you can eat it fresh. You can put it in baked goods, or you can even have it in a cider. Great thing about the Asian pear, way fewer pest and disease issues, and you're going to have a really consistent production. So next, for an alternative to apples are crab apples. So we define a crab apple as any apple with fruit smaller than 2 inches. They're most commonly planted as street trees or ornamental trees with very small fruit. So we try to look for larger fruited trees. Crab apples are incredible pollinator trees because they have a long bloom time. I believe their bloom time is about 10 days. They're high in fiber, antioxidants, and flavonoids, and they're great for digestion. As far as the flavor profile, they're a bit tart, sometimes even sour, but they still have a true apple flavor. You can use them in a crab apple butter, a jelly, I believe a chutney, and you can even put them in cider. So whenever we do our cider press tour during the festival circuit, this past year we added crabapple, and it gave it kind of this nice like tangy flavor. So it really just kind of added like a different type of apple flavoring. Some varieties of crabapple were actually historically valued for their fruit rather than just the ornamental value. And last alternative for an apple is the jujube. So this is an easy to grow fruit with a sweet, mildly tart apple-like flavor. The cool thing about jujube is you can have 2 different flavor experiences depending on when you harvest them. So if you pick your jujube in August, September, while it's still green, so if you look at the photo on the top right corner, you'll see we have some jujubes. Some of them are a little more of a green yellowish color. You're gonna have a more apple-like experience. It's gonna be crispier. It's gonna have more of that apple flavor. If you pick it around September, October, you're gonna have a date-like experience. Another name for the jujube is the Chinese date. So it'll have more of like a reddish brown fruit. Jujubes are high in vitamin A, C, fiber, and antioxidants. And they have no pest and disease issues. So this is a great alternative to an apple. Dried leaves and root bark have been traditionally used for medicinal purposes as well. So now we're going to look into some alternatives to stone fruit. There aren't any true alternatives, but we do have some close, just as delicious alternatives. So persimmons. So first thing to keep in mind with them is out of all the fruit trees that we grow, the persimmons are the easiest to grow. And this is because they have basically no pest and disease issues. They're self-fertile, they're not cold sensitive, and they produce year after year after year. So this is a great tree to have if you're wanting just a tree that will be very prolific. Something to keep in mind about persimmons is that all American persimmons and some Asian variety of persimmons are very astringent until they're fully ripe. So you want to wait until they're ripe before you pick it, or you're going to have a very uncomfortable experience when you bite into it. It's going to be really astringent, you're going to pucker, it's going to be bitter, it's going to be awful. The only exception to that is the Fuyu persimmon, which is an Asian variety. You may have seen it in the grocery store. They kind of look like tiny tomatoes. They're orange and they can be eaten while firm. Persimmons are high in vitamin C and beta carotene. And once they are ripe, they're so delicious. If you've never had a persimmon, it almost has this like gooey kind of like jello consistency to them. It's really cool. You can have them fresh. They're fantastic in a jam. You can make them into fruit leather, smoothies, baked goods, or even a Japanese method of drying them called hoshigaki. So this is when you skin the astringent persimmon and you hang it on a string, and it kind of has like a dried apricot result. You can freeze or soak your persimmon in vinegar to help remove the astringency. And as a result, you can even have like a really nice like persimmon flavored vinegar. And now we're moving on to the fig, which I'm sure many people are super familiar with here in Philly. The main crop ripens in August through October. And you know that it's time to pick it because the fruit will be soft and it will kind of bend the stem down. You don't want to judge just based on the color because a fig can be green and be ripe and ready to go. So you want to make sure that it's soft and it's kind of bending down. Some years, if we have a mild winter, we have something called a breva crop. So this is when fruit buds overwinter and they produce fruit that ripens in around like July, a little bit before the main crop ripens. Really cool fun fact about figs are, out of everything that we plant, they have the highest mineral content. So they have calcium, iron, copper, potassium, and magnesium. Figs are one of my personal favorites. They're delicious for fresh eating. You can make them into all sorts of jams. Phil was kind enough to make a larchwood jam. Larchwood figs are my favorite because they're green on the outside and really bright pink on the inside, and they're super sweet. You can also have them dried and late unripe green figs. So say it's October and you notice you have these tiny little figs still on your tree that can't ripen. They can be preserved in syrup or pickled. I haven't tried it myself, but I am very interested in trying that this year. So if anyone does that, please let us know what your results are. That'd be really cool. And we have the pawpaw, which is the highly coveted fruit. This is the banana of the north. So this is a great alternative if you're wanting tropical fruit. It's the northerly cousin of fruits such as the custard apple or the soursop. If you look at a pawpaw, it has kind of like a banana-like flavor and texture. It's almost like a pudding when you kind of break it open. It's really cool. It's native to North America, and it's very high in protein. For every 100 grams, you get 10% of your daily value of potassium, 39% of your daily value of iron, 130% manganese, and 25% copper. Something that Phil always likes to say is that like 3/4 of people who will try a pawpaw will think it's like the best thing they've ever eaten, and a quarter will be like, this is awful, like why would you put this in your mouth? So everyone is different, but I highly recommend experiencing it. Again, we want to eat sparingly if you've never had a pawpaw before, because it can cause digestive issues or be irritating. So when you're having a pawpaw, just kind of eat slow and see how your body is acclimating. Pawpaws have a short shelf life, so you can freeze the pulp and use it to bake into breads or puddings or ice creams. Another thing I want to mention about a pawpaw is if you do want one, you need to make sure you have 2 for pollination. So now we're going to talk about alternatives to fruits like blueberries and cherries. So we have the Nanking cherry, which is my favorite fruit. You can see me pictured here eating one at our Overbrook partner site last year. Nanking cherries are a true cherry. But the only difference between a Nanking cherry and a regular cherry is that it actually grows on a bush versus a tree. And with a Nanking cherry, you're gonna have way fewer pest and disease issues. You do need 2 Nanking cherries for pollination, but they're so much easier to grow. They have a very dense bloom. So if you see on the top right-hand corner here, it's just really densely packed, and you end up getting a really prolific yield. So if you're a big fan of cherries, I highly recommend, if you're looking to plant a cherry tree, to consider doing Nanking cherries. They have great ornamental value with fragrant spring flowers, and they are East Asian in origin. They have a sweet kind of tart ripening, and you can usually harvest them around midsummer, and they're high in vitamin A, C, and iron. So you can cook it in a small amount of water to burst the skin, separate the pits, and make tarts, jellies, or sauces. Or you can be like me and you can just pick it in one spot for 20 minutes. And another favorite of mine is the Juneberry. So this is a pop favorite because it's a nitrogen fixing plant. So it helps improve the soil for any plant that's around it. It's one of the first plants that we have that like bear fruit. So it usually has fruit around like May. It's super shade tolerant and it's very easy to grow. The fruit can be kind of astringent. They're kind of small and cherry-like, and they have little pits that are edible. Kind of has a little bit of a cherry flavor, but it's a little bit more on the astringent side. So I highly recommend them for jelly. I like eating them right off the bush. They're high in vitamin A, C, E, flavonoids, and fatty acids. And then we have our Juneberry, which is also known as a serviceberry. They're commonly planted as street trees and park trees all over the city. They're native to Pennsylvania, and the fruit has a very interesting profile. It is like a blueberry, and it has a little bit of a slight cherry flavor, but then inside of it, there are these tiny edible seeds, and they kind of taste like almonds. So you end up having these different complex layering of flavors. They're high in anthocyanins, which is a type of antioxidant, and fiber. And indigenous people used to create something called pemmican, which was like a nutrient-dense cake with animal fat, dried meat, and these berries. You can use June berries for all sorts of things. You can have them in jellies, preserves, baked goods, ice cream, kombucha. And you can join us every June for Juneberry Joy, which we'll hopefully be having again this year, to pick June berries and use them however you like. All right, so I'm going to pass it on to Phil, who's going to talk about some more alternatives to common plants, edible plants.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with some citrus alternatives. Obviously, most citrus are not viable in this climate outside of a greenhouse. We are very excited. POP is at some point this summer going to be building a high tunnel to experiment with some zone 8 crops, which does mean we can try out some of our citrus fruits, some of the hardier ones like kumquats and yuzu and other things. But we have a couple things you can also grow outside. One is sorrel, which is a perennial green, one that comes back year after year and has wonderful lemony flavored leaves that can be used in salads and soups. Very easy to grow, and a great perennial crop component of a food forest. The sour flavor is due to the presence of oxalic acid. So it's when planted at schools, the kids will call it lemon lettuce. It's really a very strong, bright lemony flavor. Has some medicinal value. You do want to be careful to not eat it in large quantities, because oxalic acid can, consumed too much, can result in kidney stones and lock up calcium in the body. But here's a little recipe for citrus herb dressing where the citrus is actually sorrel. So you can include it in salads and give you some of that citrus flavor. And then there is actually one citrus plant that we can grow in Philadelphia and has been grown here since the colonial era, which is the Trifoliate Orange, which is a very hardy form of citrus. It is I believe the only deciduous citrus. So that's why it gets through our winters here, because it actually does drop its leaves in the winter. But it's a pretty cool plant. We have most years done a pop harvest workshop on Trifoliate oranges, picking them from some historic sites around the city, and showing off various purposes. They are extremely sour and also have a very thick rind and a lot of seeds. So this is not a fruit that you're just going to pick and eat, but it can be used to make things, which is pretty cool. You can make a like Trifoliate orange lemonade with enough sugar, and it's nice to squeeze a little in some tea. Folks have made marmalade out of the rinds. I've heard various things about the quality of that marmalade, but it is possible. The juice with its high acidity can be used as part of a cleaning agent. So there are many uses for this, and pretty neat that we can grow some citrus outside in this climate. Next, I'm going to talk about some orchard proteins. So yeah, we think a lot about the fruit from an orchard, but we can also add protein to our diet from various orchard plants. So just talking about some of our favorite nuts to grow. hardy almonds is one of our favorite discoveries of something that can grow well in this climate. So we tried true almonds for a number of years, and they always flower so early that they almost every year get hit by a frost and don't crop at all. But we discovered that there are some peach almond hybrids. They're closely related, peaches and almonds, and there's some natural crosses that have the hardiness of a peach, but the production of an almond. And they're very intensely flavored almonds, really, really delicious, almost the flavor of an almond paste. And they're pretty prolific producers. We have discovered that they do suffer from some of the same challenges that other stone fruits do, particularly oriental fruit moth, ruining some of the fruit. But they are incredibly tasty. They're high in protein, fiber, vitamin E, magnesium. They can be harvested at different times of the year with different textures and flavors. I've heard that in Spain there are 7 different times when they're harvested with different taste qualities associated with those times. You can even harvest them as green almonds in late spring and eat them whole, an interesting delicacy before the seeds have hardened. So you just eat the whole thing like a fruit. I tried one last year and it was interesting. I don't know if I loved it, but you might experiment with exact timing to get it to have good flavor. And most common time to pick them is in September, when the hulls, the sort of leathery covering around the seed breaks open, and that's when they're generally ready for picking and can be, stored. They're fully developed nuts at that point. And there's a little information here about proper curing and storage possibilities for them as well. Our other favorite nut tree to plant in Philadelphia is chestnut, and this is for the reason that most nut trees not only get to be very large trees, but they also suffer from squirrel predation. We have a lot of squirrels in the city, and so chestnuts have these spiky balls around the nut that are at least squirrel resistant. And of course, chestnut was the predominant species in the eastern United States and North America until it was hit by the chestnut blight in the early 20th century, and they were pretty much all wiped out. So we're mostly planting Chinese chestnuts or hybrid varieties. They are developing some blight-resistant American varieties or varieties that are mostly American and with some other species to provide that blight resistance. Chestnuts are wonderful, high in starch, low in fat. So they're a little different from some other nuts in their nutritional values. So they should be cured for 2 weeks for storage. Generally, they ripen in September, October. They'll usually drop from the tree when ripen. You need to pick them fast before the squirrels get to the ones on the ground. But you can boil them or roast them. There's various ways to preserve and eat them. Hazelnuts there's actually a lot of research going on these days about hazelnuts as a new staple crop that is, far more ecological than annual crops that they may replace, like soy and other things like that. So a potentially transformative new perennial crop. But they're one that we've planted quite a bit for one reason is that they are a smaller tree. So there's not every site in the city has enough space for a very large nut tree. So this is one that's more of a large shrub rather than a tree, usually getting 10 to 15 feet in size. And they are prolific producers. They do have challenges with squirrels, which are not easily solved. You can try to pick them early and outcompete the squirrels, but basically, if you want to grow good hazelnuts, it's best to plant them in an open field where there's at least 20 to 30 feet between them and the nearest sort of larger trees. and squirrels are hesitant to cross that kind of open grass to get to them. They're excellent in flavor, high in nutrition with protein, fats, vitamins B and E. Generally, you wait till the husks have turned brown in late August, September to harvest. Again, if you have squirrel issues, you may need to try a little earlier when they're still green. But they often, in the right setting, they would drop to the ground and be easily harvested from the ground. Again, you can dry them, roast them, and have good storage time when properly processed. Ginkgo, another one of our favorite pop harvests of the year. We generally have a ginkgo harvest and nut roast each season. It is an amazing plant, survivor of a really prehistoric plant from the Jurassic period that was, from what we can tell, saved in history by a Buddhist monk in China and now grown around the world. It's actually a wonderful urban tree, so planted all over the city as street trees and park trees. And of course, it is known as the stinko ginkgo. This is a terrible smelling fruit with a tasty nut inside of it. So it is tricky to harvest. So they'll drop to the ground. You will need to wear gloves to pick them, because not only is the fruit stinky, but it contains the same substance as poison ivy. So you don't want to touch the flesh to touch your body at all. But you would gather it with gloves, put it in water, and again, wearing gloves, remove the flesh. Then they have these tasty nuts. They can be roasted, kind of like roasted peanuts. I think they have their own flavor, almost, I would even say a cheesy flavor to them, but they're quite tasty. You just roast them in a skillet. You do want to keep in mind that you should eat no more than 10 per day. They can cause issues if they're consumed in too high of a quantity. But it is abundant harvest available in the city because they're so commonly planted. Last, just wanted to mention acorns is another potentially super abundant urban harvest opportunity. Pretty much all acorns are edible, some more so than others. What sort of makes them different is that they have very high tannin levels. So they're not a nut that you would crack open and eat. You need to leach out those tannins. In many indigenous communities, this was a staple food, and one of their methods of leaching would be to submerge the nuts in a flowing stream, and gradually the water over time would leach out the tannins. You can do that by putting them in several changes of water. One I've heard is putting a bag in the water container above your toilet, which is clean water. But every time you flush the toilet, it would send a new change of water through the nuts and help leach out the tannins. But acorn flour is the common use for this, so you can make acorn breads and other things. But the city is full of oak trees. They do occur in mast years, which means they don't drop many nuts every year, but they will have a super large drop in particular years. So you want to observe your trees and know which ones are going to be happening which year. Go ahead, next slide. And then last one I want to mention in this category is mushrooms, particularly King Stropharia, also known as wine caps or garden giants. And this is one of the easiest mushrooms to grow. It's also very identifiable. It's not a mushroom you're going to confuse with anything else. I don't know if you can't really see in those photos, but it's got a little secondary ring below the cap that is unique to the wine cap. So it really can't be mistaken for other mushrooms if you know what to look for. But the great thing about it for us in orchards is that it's a mushroom that grows happily in mulch, in wood mulch, which is something we're always doing in our orchards is spreading wood chips. So seeding those, inoculating those with Stropharia, can be a great bonus harvest for your orchard space. And just at the bottom, again, to mention, make sure a proper identification of mushrooms. And I'm going to turn it over to Corey to take us through some herbal allies and volunteer plants.
If we could pause for 1 second, there was a question about pecans, which may be good to, if we're going to talk about them at all now, or if you could just bring them up briefly.
Sure. We have not planted many pecans or their relatives because of squirrel issues. But of course, there are pecans that are hardy here, and their relatives, the hickories, are native. And there has been some breeding work on hickories as well. But they certainly, are a tasty nut. They get to be very large trees, so keep that in mind. 60 feet or more in size at maturity. But yeah, I would love to find some more spots in the city where we could trial some pecans and hickories. And hecons, which are a cross between pecan and a hickory. Yes, you also, for most nuts, need more than one plant. They're not self-fertile.
Okay, Corey again here with you, and we're gonna jump back or jump into Herbal Allies. We talked at the top about food forests, how we plant different layers of plants, and that understory plant is made up of many different herbs, many of them medicinal. And if you were with us last week, we talked about how these act as companion plants, drawing in different beneficials and predators into your space, but they also serve as another function. They serve as both food and medicine. And so we're gonna highlight just a couple of the ones, our favorite herbs that we commonly plant. But before we do that, I'm gonna breeze through a couple of common ways to consume these herbs. So one, drying the herbs, of course, using them to spice your food. You could dry them in the dehydrators like Phil was talking about, or more commonly just hang them upside down as pictured here. You want to hang them in a cool, dry, dark place with airflow going through it. And when I'm doing something with seeds like fennel or coriander, I put that bundle inside a paper bag. And then if the seeds kind of shatter and drop, then I'm able to catch them and use them later. And then teas or infusions and decoctions are just names for teas. So they are gentle and safe and hydrating to take as medicine. And so the infusions we use for the leaves or the flowers or the seeds, you're going to use about an ounce of fresh herb to a quart of water, or 2 to 3 tablespoons dried. That varies between things, but that's kind of a good starting ground. You boil the water, pour them over the herbs, let it steep for 15 to 30 minutes covered, and then you could strain and drink it. Drinking a quart throughout the day is really recommended. You can store that tea in your fridge for up to 3 days, and adding some lemon will help extract some of that medicinal qualities. These are medicinal strength qualities I'm talking about. Decoctions are for the roots, the barks, the nuts, those harder to extract parts of the plant. Think ginger or cinnamon or echinacea. You boil the water and then you add the plant material right into the pot. Simmer it for 15 to 20 minutes with the lid, 15 to 20 minutes, turn it off, put the lid on, and then steep for an hour. And after that, you could strain and consume. And then tinctures, as old as time, people have been doing this to preserve their medicine, their herbs, alcohol stores for a very long time. And this could be very easy or very complicated. but just roughly you take your fresh herbs, you chop them up, or you put them in a blender with alcohol or glycerin, put the lid on, put it in a dark, cool place, shake it as often as you can remember, wait for at least one lunar cycle, or maybe you forgot about it in a closet for a couple of years, that's still okay. You can then just strain it and use it. There's varying amounts to use. You'll have to look that up at a reliable source. But a great way to preserve medicine, simple. And then topically, we can use the herbs, right? So you use them either as just an oil where you infuse oil with herbs, which can be done in lots of different ways. You can kind of do it like the tincture. Take dried herbs. You don't want to use fresh for oils because the moisture within that fresh herb will cause the oil to mold and go rancid pretty quick. So dried herbs, cover them with oil, put them in a cool, dark place, shake as often as you remember. Some people do solar extractions or lunar extractions. You could also do it on the stove top or in a crock pot. Lots of different ways to do it. And then after you have that herbal salve, you can add melted wax to the infused oil. And the more wax, the firmer your salve will be. But it's just a very simple process to make it into salve and really nourishing for the skin. So jumping into a couple of the herbs. First, Echinacea. Echinacea is great taken when you're starting to feel sick. It stimulates the production of white blood cells, jumpstarts the immune system, and it inhibits the spread of infection, which usually happens at the beginning of your illness. You can use the leaves, the flower petals, and the roots. The roots tend to be the strongest, but herbalists say that it is best when used in combination. So you'll harvest the leaves and the flowers when the flowers are in full bloom, and you don't want to take more than 10 to 20% of the total flower leaf mass so that you don't kill the plant. And then roots are harvested in the fall, usually several years when they're several years old so that they're big enough to really take the plant out. And then if I was making a tea with this, I'd do the decoction of the roots. And after I had simmered and I turned the heat off, I would add the leaves and the flowers for that hour of steeping. And that's how I would use different parts of the plants together. Elderberries, not really an herb, but a great medicinal shrub that we love to grow. And both the flowers and the berries are medicinal. The flowers are good for while you are sick. It shortens the duration and severity of flu symptoms and is also anti-inflammatory. Whereas the berries, kind of like Echinacea, you want to take when you're starting to get sick. And that also works well as a decongestant, drying out your sinuses. The flowers can be used as a drink, as a tea, or you could make them into a tincture. You will harvest them. You'll see that they are a composite flower, that umbel. So when they're 2/3 of those flowers are open, that's when you harvest. And then you rub the umbels on a mesh screen and the individual flowers will drop out. At that point, you can use them immediately to make tincture, tea. You wouldn't make a salve with these or an oil. They don't have that topical benefit, but they have such a short shelf life. So if you're not going to use them immediately, you'll want to dry them or freeze them. And then the berries, very important to know, are not poisonous, but they could cause you to have an upset stomach and diarrhea if you eat them fresh. You need to have them cooked to eat them. And they ripen pretty unevenly, kind of over a 2-week period. That you'll know they're ripe because they're deep purple, and when you squish them, a bright red juice will come out and stain your hands. We recommend harvesting whole bunches instead of trying to harvest the individual berries, and then just put that whole bunch on a cookie sheet and stick it in the freezer. The berries will freeze individually and easily pull off the stem, and from there you could just put it in a bag or a jar, put it back in the freezer, and make some elderberry syrup or other products when you're ready. We have a great recipe on our resource page, and usually have a workshop on that in the fall. Peppermint is wonderful for digestion. It eases nausea or cramping if you got over eager about that elderberry and ate it fresh. Can really help out. One time when I got sick, it was hard for me to keep stuff down because I got overeager with the wild ginger. I made a steam, and you make it basically a strong tea, and then put it in a bowl, lean your face over the bowl, and put a towel over yourself, over your head and the bowl together. So you kind of create this little sauna and inhale as much as you can. And that was able to ease the nausea enough for me. So it has a really nice digestive quality. It's also cooling to the body. So if you're out in the orchard and you're starting to feel overheated, or your friend is, you can make a mint tea or just put it in your water, chew on it, cool, and it can help you cool down, brings down fevers, eases headaches. It's a nervine, so it did generally, it's a pandemic. Our senses are aware. We're always kind of tense and in a state of fight or flight, right? And so nervines tell your body that you're okay. You can sleep, you can digest, you can focus, and mint in particular is very stimulating and helping you focus. Also, but it can increase heartburn. So if you're suffering from heartburn, just ease off of it, and that should help. You want to harvest when it's in full bloom. All of the aerial parts are good, fresh or dried. For herbs in general, you want to harvest late morning after the dew has dried. When it's hotter out, the volatile oils will be stronger, which is what you're looking for. Fennel is a favorite for pop, brings in lots of pollinators. It stimulates digestion and reduces intestinal gas. It's often in Indian cultures. If you go to the restaurant afterward, they have these fennel seeds covered in colorful sugar. And likewise in the orchard, after you're eating, you could just go through, pick a couple of the seeds is what you want, and just chew on those. You could use it in combination with catnip for colic, indigestion, and diarrhea. It's safe for infants, stimulates milk flow. Through a breastfeeding mom can pass these benefits on to their infant through the milk, but not safe for pregnant women. So be careful there. And those frondy, feathery tops can be used culinarily for fishes and stews. And like I said, the seeds are the medicinal part. Yarrow is a great one. It's antiseptic. It stops bleeding. I got to try this firsthand. While pruning and cutting myself, I was not prepared. I didn't have any first aid kit. But I did find Yarrow, nature's first aid kit. I made what they call a spit poultice, where I chewed the leaves up and then stuck it on the cut and held it there for a while. And it very quickly stopped the bleeding. I was very impressed. If you're more prepared, you could take the leaves and dry them, and then when it's time to apply it, you could just mix it with some water. It's also good for black and blue eyes, bruising, oozy blood. So it's a great one for that. The flowers are also medicinal and used to induce sweat to break a fever, and just in general help your body fight infection. And then we're going to talk about some volunteer plants, some wild edibles that we can harvest. Of course, we want to remember what Phil said at the top about being aware of where we're harvesting, if any sprays happen there, do we have permission, is there soil contamination? You need to kind of mind your P's and Q's, but these ones we've selected because they are prolific in the orchard spaces, which usually tend to be safer spaces to harvest from. So first, dandelions, which 100% of our participants are familiar with, and I'm happy to hear it. These are great for stimulating digestion and aids in cleaning the liver. They come up in the spring when we have, right after winter, when we've been eating a lot of heavy foods and sitting around and our liver needs to be cleared. And so their leaves are great for that. The flowers are a great source of vitamin C and iron. They can help to lower the blood pressure and boost immunity. And the roots are probiotic and antiviral. The combination of things I'm telling you about, I like to make into a pesto to do my little liver cleanse in the springs. So the greens could be used in a pesto, the flowers as a salad topping, and the roots are really delicious, could be used in stir fries and in decoctions. Garlic mustard is an invasive that was brought here by the colonizers to fight parasitic worms and gangrene and scurvy, not things that we really deal with so much anymore. And they are just prolific. They have thousands of seeds per plant. They're alleliopathic, which means they don't allow other seeds to germinate where they are. And so I encourage you to properly identify and harvest prolifically, harvest by the root, not because you want the root, but because we want to get rid of this thing. But they do have a really nice strong garlic flavor, and could be used as a garlic substitute in your spring pesto. And then red clover, so nutritious, rich in calcium, iron, and nitrogen, used to detoxify the blood, used to treat skin problems. A lot of times when you do clean out your liver, it comes out as skin rashes. And so red clover is a nice follow-up to that detox. It's also great when you have those deep, persistent coughs that you just can't shake. It's an expectorant. It helps you get that out. And it's often called a woman's herb. It alleviates menstrual and menopausal symptoms. Unlike other herbs you harvest early in the morning, you can properly identify it from other clovers because it has this chevron, this light green within the darker green leaf. And it has a great sweet, light taste to it. And then the plantain is one that we use topically to treat stings and bug bites, scrapes and bruises. It draws the toxins out of the body and reduces inflammation. So I'm always looking for this because it's always around when I get stung by a bee. I make that spit poultice, apply it, and it helps reduce the inflammation and pull out the toxin, which is great. Putting this into a salve and making an herbal oil out of this is a great idea. And that is our talk for tonight.